Hello everyone. Starmergeddon 2.0, rather like The Godfather Part 2. I mean in reference to my previous video, Starmergeddon 1. But the reality is our Prime Minister Keir Starmer is annihilatory in multiple directions. And of course, nuclear war really is Armageddon. Let me start by saying I have Polish heritage on both sides, my maternal and paternal side. And Poland has a shared history and heritage with Ukraine, spanning many centuries. The largest city in western Ukraine, and the sixth largest city in Ukraine as a whole, was part of Poland prior to the Second World War. It was then known in Polish as Lwów. And throughout much of history, Poland's borders as the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth extended far into present Ukraine. Indeed, under the Polish king Casimir IV Jagiellon, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth extended as far as the Black Sea. And so there's a lot of shared history. Poland's borders incidentally shifted, as many know, to the west after the Second World War. So Poland lost Lwów, or Lviv, in present-day Ukraine, and Vilnius was also part of Poland previously, but became the capital of Lithuania. And on the west side, Poland gained the German city of Breslau, or Wrocław in Polish, and the German city of Poznań, or Poznań in Polish. And I learned Polish, and I learned a lot about Polish history when I was a teen because of my family. And I also went on Polish YMCA summer camps. And one of our campfire songs was this 19th century Polish folk song called Hej Sokoły, and it begins Żal, żal za dziewczyną z zieloną Ukrainą, which translates as pity, pity for the girl from green Ukraine. So given my heritage and my background, it's fair to say that the very last thing I want is for Slavs to be massacring Slavs, Europeans killing Europeans, and destroying Europe. I should say, destroying even more of Europe. Yet the situation is being escalated, with Ukraine firing several US suppliers, ATACMS, into Kursk in Russia in the last week, and Russia retaliating by deploying its intermediate range Oreshnik missile. Oreshnik, by the way, means hazel tree in Russian, at the Ukrainian city of Dnipro. What is essential now is de-escalation. And from the British perspective, of course, no one here, no one in Britain voted for British troops to be sent to the Ukraine. We have heard many times that the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2002 was unprovoked. The legacy media keeps telling us that. But is that entirely true? Well, the US made it very, very clear that they were putting Ukraine on their side and would go right up to the 2,100-kilometer border with Russia with troops and missiles supplied by the US. And if we're honest, the Nord Stream pipelines that were blown up with disastrous environmental consequences, I should say, we need to ask ourselves, would Russia blow up their own energy pipeline, thereby giving up power, wealth, and leverage over Germany and other European countries? Tellingly, Joe Biden said in February 2022 on camera, if Russia invades, then there will be no longer Nord Stream 2, we will bring an end to it. And when a reporter asked him how, and what exactly he meant, given that the project Nord Stream is in Germany's control, Biden replied, I promise you that we'll do that. So I think the culprit is quite self-evident. pushing NATO expansion further and further has been the open and stated goal of politicians in the West for a long time. And this is despite NATO's commitment that they would never do so at the time that the Soviet Union was disintegrating and the Russian Federation about to form. Notably, German Foreign Minister at the time, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, stated in January 1990, no matter what happens in Warsaw Pact countries, that was the Eastern Alliance at the time, there'll be no expansion of NATO territory to the east, that is, closer to the borders of the Soviet Union. A similar assurance was offered a month later by Robert Gates, who was then Deputy National Security Advisor to the US President, then, of course, George Bush Sr., in his conversation with the KGB of the USSR at the time, Vladimir Kryunkov. Subsequently, not only Germany, but which was who Russia was afraid would gain NATO membership at the time, but indeed Poland, Romania, Turkey, Georgia, the Baltic states, and even now historically neutral Finland last year also joined NATO. So it is fair to say that the West, NATO, has reneged on those commitments. In 2022, Boris Johnson scuppered the Ukraine-Russia peace deal, advising Zelensky not to entertain a compromise of peace. Indeed, Labour, in their 2004 general election manifesto, pushed for NATO expansion into Ukraine. This was actually one of their pledges in their manifesto. Why? We need to ask ourselves that question. Qui bono? Who benefits? Well, as usual, we need to follow the money. I mean, first of all, Ukraine is an agricultural powerhouse. It's often referred to as the breadbasket of Europe. But additionally, Ukraine has many raw materials. 7% of the world's titanium reserves, 500,000 tons of lithium, beryllium, uranium, and zirconium. It's also the world's fifth largest producer of gallium, which is used in semiconductors and LEDs, and has 20% of the world's graphite reserve. It is understandable, given the raw materials, that both Russia and the West would want its leadership allied with each of them. But why NATO? Why does NATO matter? Well, the US wants more countries to join NATO because each member country of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, has to conform its military purchases to NATO weapon specifications, i.e., those that are set by the main suppliers to NATO, the Northrop, Grumman, Boeing, Raytheon, General Dynamics, and Lockheed Martin. These are all American corporations. Now, hundreds of billions of dollars have been now signed off by US Congress to be funneled into Ukraine, or more specifically to be funneled into US defense manufacturers and contractors. And not to put a fine point on it, but also to Volodymyr Zelensky's lifestyle. Instantly, Volodymyr and Vladimir are the same name, simply the Ukrainian and Russian versions, respectively. Senior Democrat US politicians have described the money being signed off by US Congress to Ukraine, or to US contractors in Ukraine, as a loan. Or why would they describe it as a loan? Well, Firstly, so that the US, American can impose conditions onto Ukraine. These include, firstly, that Ukraine has to put up for sale all its government-owned assets to multinational corporations, including all of its agricultural land. And remember, I said this is the best quality agricultural land in Europe. If not the world, it's very, very fertile. It's incredibly good soil. 30% of Ukrainian land has already been sold to DuPont, Cargill, and Monsanto, which is now part of Bayer. And all these companies, of course, are owned ultimately by our good friends BlackRock. And secondly, well, not necessarily the intentions, but the consequence of imposing conditions on Ukraine are extreme austerity measures. So the very poor in Ukraine will remain very poor. Whereas the war, the purpose of war, is to make more money. Ultra wealthy people wanting to make even more money after killing hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians. But even considering the ulterior motive for involving ourselves in Ukraine, the American military-industrial complex, and assuming that that is a morally just thing, why should British foreign policy be forged around someone else's interests? What interest does Britain have in this bloody money funneling scheme? What is the return on investment for British taxpayers of Britain committing £13 billion to Ukraine, which is more than half of the 22 billion supposed black hole, by the way, while same British taxpayers see their energy costs skyrocket? And let's not forget that the UK banned Russian import in 2002. Previously, the UK imported about 6% of its oil and 4% of its gas from Russia. And that energy demand has not decreased. So guess what happens to energy prices? We also know that Prime Minister Keir Starmer has recently met with Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock. And we also know that there'll be huge financial profits to be made after the war, when everything that was destroyed in Ukraine has to be rebuilt. And indeed, Zelensky has announced an alliance with BlackRock for that very purpose, for the reconstruction of Ukraine. We must act, or we should act, in my view, and I think most British taxpayers and voters would agree with me, according to the UK's national interests. But instead, we seem to be acting on behalf of globalist interests with neocon warhawks like Robert Kagan, Victoria Nuland, Liz Cheney and Antony Blinken calling the shots. It's quite possible that many of these people and associates of theirs have shareholdings in US defense contractors. So what really has changed since 2003, when, acting as George Bush Jr.'s poodle, Tony Blair took us to war in Iraq illegally? Well, the UK Parliament has no legal role in approving military action, but since 2011, there has been a convention in place that Parliament should be at least informed and consulted, or the Commons at least should be informed and consulted before Britain deploys its troops. So Jeremy Corbyn, and I'm no fan of Jeremy Corbyn, but he was quite right to tweet on the 20th of November as follows: the Prime Minister should make a statement to Parliament immediately to confirm whether UK missiles have been fired into Russia. He must tell the British public if this means we are now at war with a nuclear power. what risk this poses to people in Britain, and why this action was taken without any approval from Parliament. Now, as I say, approval from Parliament is not strictly necessary. However, the remainder of what Corbyn tweeted there is, I can't fault any of it. I mean, he's bang on there. I want to make clear as well that Vladimir Putin, of course, bears responsibility. He bears responsibility for invading Ukraine in a way where hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have been killed and injured. And of course, Russia is not the Shangri-La that some would believe under Vladimir Putin. There is repression. People are sent to prison for political reasons, although of course that's now happening in the UK as well. 9% of Russians live below the poverty line, although, to be fair, it's declined from 13% in 2015, and that's despite Western sanctions. Putin's use of North Korean mercenaries in the war, 10,000 of them, is very telling. It indicates that he is struggling to recruit Russian troops. And it would suggest to me that his popularity is very strong in Russia, but it does have limitations. Incidentally, North Korean fertility rate stands at 1.8, and that compared to the Russian fertility rate is 1.4. So Russia is facing, like much of the West, sort of an existential population crisis. A topic for a further video, but one I would very much like to explore. Incidentally, South Korea's faring the worst. It's got extinction level fertility rate of 0.78, and things are very, very serious there. Well, going back to Ukraine, there needs to be a peace negotiation. Will some land have to be traded? Well, perhaps so, but that's what France and Germany argued for in relation to Crimea in 2014. I don't think we can trust Putin when he says he does not want to invade and hold on to Ukrainian territory. So, that will probably be a reality in any brokered peace deal. Crimea, of course, provides Russia with access to Turkey and the Middle East, port in the Black Sea. And it's fair to say there is a large Russian, I think, majority in Crimea, and Russia has large Russian minorities in Donbass and a few other regions in eastern Ukraine. But there will need to be a peace negotiation. This can't go on forever, and of course Putin won't back down, and certain governments in the West won't back down. But please, for plucking misspell to the wannabe adults remaining in the room, no nuclear war. Let's have de-escalation and ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine as far as we can. I don't believe either Putin or even Democrat politicians are so stupid that they would bring us into a nuclear Armageddon where now 5.8 billion people are capable of being annihilated within 73 minutes. But they may certainly bring us perilously close if things continue. And we should certainly not be giving permission for UK missiles to be used, and worse, for UK troops to be deployed. Certainly not just before a change in the US administration that will bring about a negotiated peace. And all I can say is thank God for President Trump.